In this, our second to last panel, we'll be talking about immunotherapies. These, I think all of you have some familiarity with what's happened the past several years that's revolutionized the treatment of cancer. We'll be discussing what's great about it, if there's anything that's hyped about it, and where things are going. Our moderator today is Lindsey Pujanandez from Science Translational Medicine. Thank you, Lindsey, for doing this today. Lindsey covers related topics for Science Magazine. And Lindsey will introduce each of our panelists.
Hi, I'm Lindsey, as just stated. And so I'm coming at this from the editor's chair at Science Translational Medicine, where I'm an associate editor. I am part of a team. We cover all of biomedicine. I'm the pet immunologist, so I have the privilege of covering cancer immunotherapy, as well as infectious diseases, autoimmunity, and other related things. And so in thinking about coming and doing this panel today, what occurred to me was, the wide sea of papers that we receive day in, day out from scientists trying to do translational medicine. And right now, cancer immunotherapy is a pretty big part of that. And we see a lot at the beginning, starting in cell lines and mice, maybe a few things in patients, that we promote what we think is going to make it, what we think is sound science, but so much of it doesn't jump the gap and make it into patients, or if it does make it into patients, it fails at various stages. So I hope to talk a little bit today about how to get things forward, how the things we're seeing now in the clinic started out, and some of the challenges. So on the panel today, we have 3 great scientists from Hopkins, and I'm going to let them talk about themselves a little bit more, but we have Dr. John Powell, Dr. Dung Lee, and Dr. Julie Bramer. So Julie, do you want to start?
Sure. I'm Dr. Julie Bramer. I'm the director of the Thoracic Oncology Program and also a member of the BKI as the lead of the Upper Aero Digestive Program. And I've been a part of the immunotherapy research, bringing a drug into first in human. It used to be called MDX1106 and now is called Opdivo. And I was part of bringing this type of drug into use for lung cancer patients, as well as some of the other trials that have brought and now approved for use pembrolizumab in the first-line treatment for non-small cell lung cancer. And so that's one of my specialties, is drug development and focusing on lung cancer research. Yeah.
My name's Yung Lee. I'm an associate professor also at the Bloomberg Kimmel Institute. I take care of patients with gastrointestinal malignancies. I'm a clinical trialist. There are currently no immunotherapies approved for GI malignancies, so I take care of patients with colon cancer and pancreas cancer and those sorts of cancers. And the work that I'm doing in the clinic is trying to find treatments for these patients. There's a couple of avenues that we've been working on. One is to try to look at subsets of patients. Are there particular attributes to those patients that respond, and try to figure out who those are on a very molecular level to try to bring these treatments to those patients. And then the other area of work we're working on is the other patients where they have a tumor and microenvironment where there's really no immune infiltrate. So it's kind of an immune desert, and trying to get T cells in there and how we get those activated T cells to actually work. So one of the things that we've been moving forward based on a clinical trial that we started at Hopkins was looking at a subset of patients with colorectal cancer. It's actually approximately 4% of all solid tumor patients have something called microsatellite instability or mismatch repair deficiency. And we started looking at this because there was an individual on Julie's very first study, a colon cancer patient, a single patient who responded. And so looking at that patient and then looking at subsequent studies for colon cancer where they looked into one of the markers that they thought could select patients was PD-L1, the only colon cancer patient, despite being PD-L1 positive for all those studies, was also someone with mismatch repair deficiency. And so we started looking at those patients because they have high mutation burden, and therefore their tumors could look very foreign to the immune system. So we've looked at it in colon cancer and a lot of other diseases as well, and we are working to try to get an FDA approval for patients with mismatch repair deficiency for PD-1 inhibitors.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Powell. I'm actually one of the associate directors of the Bloomberg-Kimmel Institute for Cancer Immunotherapy at Hopkins. And actually, it's great that the three of us are here because I think it epitomizes really this idea of taking ideas or findings from basic research, which is what I focus on the most, and bringing them to the clinic and eventually to patients. And I know that the title of this session is, involves the word hype, as if we're saying too much than what's really there. And actually, I would argue with you that immunotherapy, in terms of the way it's way it is, and its future in terms of revolutionizing cancer care, is actually underappreciated. And so, to kind of bring that home to you, as many of you know, the standard way of treating patients with cancer has been, aside from surgery, where you can literally take it out, is to give them poisons that were actually, I don't know if you know this, used as chemical weapons in World War I. That's what chemotherapy is. But on the other hand, immunotherapy, and in particular the successes in immunotherapy, what we're doing is we're just blocking a negative signal. And that's really extraordinary. So we block a negative signal. The tumor has this negative signal that turns off your own immune system. The same immune system that we discussed in the last session that responds to vaccines and fights infections. And by just blocking that negative signal, we let your own body destroy the cancer. And so to me, the fact that when Julie's trial first started, she took all these patients that had failed all these other therapies, including these very powerful poisons, and we gave them this antibody that blocked the negative signal, and it allowed their own immune system to, in some cases, completely rid them of the cancer. That's extraordinary. And what it is it tells us that the immune system of humans, let me tell you, I've been curing a lot of mice in my day, but it tells you that, in fact, along those lines, I saw in clinic a patient had a little button that said, if I were a mouse, I'd be cured by now. But what it tells us, which we thought we knew, but now we had absolute proof, is that the human body, the immune system of us, people, has the capability to rid itself of cancer if we could just figure out how to get rid of these negative signals and actually enhance positive signals. So that fact, that finding, I think cannot be overstated and really provides the foundation for not only the patients that we're seeing today that are responding to therapy, but our capability to really expand the number of patients that are not only going to benefit but be cured by this revolutionary approach.
So I have a few questions of my own, but I would really hope that most of the session can be audience-driven, so please don't be shy. Ask questions as they come to you. One that I'll start out with is, does the panel think that chemotherapy is eventually going to get moved to the side and that immunotherapy is going to be a frontline defense?
Well, I think in lung cancer, it has been moved aside for a subset of patients. There is a subset of patients where, and it's about a third of non-small cell lung cancer patients who present with metastatic lung cancer, pembrolizumab or Keytruda has been approved for use based on the fact that it does help patients tumors get under control, and the cancer is under control for a much longer time compared to chemotherapy. However, that's not the majority of lung cancer patients. And I think for those patients, again, the majority of patients, chemotherapy is still here. And in fact, we're now combining the immune therapy with chemotherapy. I would love it if chemotherapy went away. But I think for the majority of lung cancer patients, not so much. And I think for a lot of us, again, that's what we're working to. Again, it makes more sense to try to give immune therapy by itself or in some type of combination, but I think there still will be a subset of patients where chemotherapy is here to stay.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely true for GI cancers as well. I mean, as much as we don't like to say it, the most effective therapy in most of our GI malignancies is chemotherapy, and it provides patients time. our goal is quality of life for the longest time possible. And so right now, for most patients, that is chemotherapy. For the subsets of patients where the immunotherapy is very active, it's incumbent upon us to try to figure out who those patients are, to bring the therapies up earlier to their treatment to see if they could avoid chemotherapy altogether. And that's still a research question. And so that's one of the things that we're trying to do, is find the right patients to bring it to earlier, so perhaps they could avoid chemotherapy. It's a challenge, though, when you're trying to do those studies, because patients and physicians are familiar with chemotherapy. They know that in certain diseases such as colorectal cancer, the response rate is quite high with chemotherapy. And so I think we have to figure out who the right patients are. And then when we get better combinations, the more research we do, maybe for other patients it could be brought further into frontline therapy.
So do you see that as more of a precision medicine initiative or personalized medicine initiative to identify the patients who will benefit the most? Which do you think is the better way forward, or we should try everything?
So I think you're going to have to define precision and personalized medicine for me, and then I can.
So I guess the way I see precision medicine is given a subset of patients based on certain characteristics. A common one, I guess, is ethnicity. I mean, you guys are the clinicians, so you know better than me. Given that certain groups of people generally respond better to something, you might treat them one way. Personalized medicine, in my mind, is you sequence them and they have these different genes, and so based on their IL-6 mutation, you're going to give them something else.
So the answer is yes and yes. So, I mean, I think MSI is sort of an example of that. Is that you find these patients because they have a particular abnormality that makes them more susceptible to a therapy. In fact, if you find patients with mismatched repair deficiency, some of them actually have Lynch syndrome, which is an inherited genetic disorder, but many of them are sporadic as well. So they are a defined patient population, but you can find them through looking at their tumor and doing the analysis. We do some either IHC or PCR-based testing or next-gen sequencing to identify these patients. So we are looking in the tumor to identify these patients.
Okay. Do we have audience questions yet, or should we just keep going?
A very basic question. When a sick patient comes to you and is brought into treatment, are they part of a controlled study with this alternate usual mode of treatment and your new improvisation, or is it a compassionate exception to allow you to use a different approach that has not yet been proven to FDA, or just how does this work?
I think when a patient comes to us in clinic, we sit down and, after evaluating the patient, we try to figure out, one, are they well enough to get treatment and to be able to handle some of the side effects that can occur with whatever we recommend, as well as for us, it's standard of care for the most part. And so we do go over that and discuss that. And again, depending on whether or not they fit into a particular subset. So say someone walks in and they want pembrolizumab for their lung cancer, but they don't have, we have to have high PD-L1 on their tumor, so a protein level has to be a certain amount, and say it's not. We do have to sit down and discuss why it's not best to give them the pembrolizumab. And we do get those questions, well, why can't I get it on compassionate use, or why can't I try to see if it can be paid by my insurance company. And we've tried to discuss about expectations for this type of therapy, because if, at least right now, for lung cancer, if your protein level on your cancer cells aren't high enough, the likelihood of your cancer having a significant response is relatively low compared to chemotherapy. But again, when you have a patient who's not well enough to get therapy at all, it's definitely a significant conversation to sit down and discuss the pros and cons of not doing the immunotherapy and how it isn't probably in their best interest. When we have patients who have no immunotherapy approved for use in their case, that's a bigger question. And again, we always like to try to get them on some type of trial to try to figure out why it's working or why it doesn't work for them. But when that's not an option, I mean, we live in an area where there's so many academic institutions or institutions that are doing clinical trials. We try to get those patients to those institutions. But, you know, if I'm living out in the middle of nowhere in my clinic and we don't have access or a patient can't travel, then sitting down and discussing about compassionate use protocols and things like that. We are very lucky that typically if a patient meets a particular criteria, we are able to get that drug for them if that's the right thing to do.
A minority of cancers that have immunotherapies that are FDA approved currently, right? Just a handful. So what is it going to take in terms of expanding that to potentially all types of cancer? I mean, since you're aiming at very specific inhibitors, I mean, is it just a process of sort of teasing out what those inhibitors are, or those proteins, or whatever on each in each of those cancer types? Because you started with melanoma, and then now we're all the way to a grouping.
Right. I think for the most part, I mean, we're very close to get FDA approval for a lot of the tumors that were the low-hanging fruit, even though lung cancer wasn't among them originally. But learning more, like Young was talking about the amount of mutations that a certain tumor has and the likelihood of response based on that, or again, PD-L1 and then other expression profiling, I think will actually greatly advance this. And actually, clinical trial design has come a long way from back in the day where, again, the goal is to identify subsets of patients. I think, like you said, you know, we're not close to being able to say immunotherapy is the right thing for all patients, but trying to figure out the personalized approach to try to figure out how best to use immunotherapy in order to help cancer control. Jonathan, I don't know.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And so what I like to say is we need to learn from our successes, right? So again, the fact that this group of patients that we've identified respond so well to the immunotherapy we have out there right now, what it's also done is we've learned why they respond. And by knowing what it takes in order to have patients respond to the current therapies we have out there, you know, people are going back and figuring out the mechanisms of why certain cancers are not responding. And so I think it's a matter of really teasing out, now that we have the absolute proof that this is going to work, it's a matter of teasing out the proper mechanisms for each of the different cancers. And as Julie mentioned, lung cancer was a surprise, right? If you had asked me, you know, before this all kind of exploded, if I thought lung cancer would be one of the first cancers to be treated with immunotherapy, I would have said no, I would have been wrong. And so I think, you know, why is that the case? We're learning from that. And now we can take that knowledge and apply it to other cancers, for example, like prostate cancer, which has not really responded that well yet to immunotherapy, and figure out why it's not, and then devise new immunotherapy to attack that specific cancer.
So just as a follow-up, how do you discern or differentiate between what you consider a targeted therapy, which I guess would target mutations, versus, so if you're teasing out these specific immune profiles of these cancers, it ends up being somewhat of a targeted therapy, right? Even though it's classified as immunotherapy. I mean, is there going to be a combination approach then?
Potentially there will be combination approaches of using more mutation-specific approaches versus immunotherapy approaches, and we're looking at trying to figure out how best to do that, because actually for our lung cancer patients, those patients with driver mutations, like patients with EGFR, epidermal growth factor receptor mutated tumors, they're less likely to respond to immune therapy, and so their targeted therapies actually work much better than immune therapy. And so we do spend a lot of time educating patients. You know, they want that immunotherapy because of all the potential hope that maybe they won't have to take treatment every day, but actually right now their molecular targeted agents are actually working better than immune therapy. But we're trying to figure out how best can we make their tumors recognized by their immune system, just like other patients who don't have that.
But another point, targeted therapy, the term targeted therapy came in vogue in targeting these mutations. Mm-hmm. But in fact, immunotherapy is the ultimate targeted therapy, because that's what your immune system does. It targets specific cancer, your cancer, and destroys it. So all immunotherapy is really targeted therapy.
I might suggest as a journalist that that's a message that you would want to broadcast on a wider basis whenever possible, because right now we define these things in these narrower segments, but you're absolutely right, obviously. So that's something that would probably be wise to make larger.
I'm just going to jump in because one of my questions actually was, what is the most common misunderstanding you hear about your work, and what would you like to clear up? Just when you communicate your findings or what you're working towards, what is it that you have a problem getting across to the more general public or to patients?
So these guys are probably better to tell you specifics, but one thing that bothers me a little bit is that when people lump all cancer therapies together, so very often, I hear of patients who are maybe older, they have horrible cancer, and they decide they don't want to be treated, or they don't want, they think of the typical being treated, losing your hair, being nauseous all the time and everything. And I think one of the beautiful things about immunotherapy is that although there are some side effects, it's a completely different approach. And as a result, some of these horrible things that people think about when they think about cancer treatment are not really associated with immunotherapy. And I think if they knew that, that would encourage more of them to seek out this kind of approach. I don't know if you guys see that.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the misconceptions for me is of course, all diseases are different, and even within GI cancers, it's very different. I think that the idea that immunotherapy it works slowly. I think that might be true in some cases where you really have to get a combination approach where you're waiting for the T cells to infiltrate into the tumor, and then you get all these checkpoints to take the brakes off. I think that could be a more delayed response. But for some of these subsets that have the T cells sitting in the tumor microenvironment, the effect can actually be quite quick. I don't know what your experience is in lung cancer, but it's definitely true for the MSI cancers. And so I think that is a misconception for mostly physicians, I think, that it would work too slow, and therefore the patient needs to get on chemotherapy right away.
Yeah, I think from my standpoint is always trying to find the middle ground. I have some patients who are like, oh, it'll be fine. If I get immunotherapy, my life will be fine. I will be cured, and I'll have no side effects. And the versus, just like Jonathan, you said, the other group of patients are people who are like, oh, it's not going to work in me. I'm going to get all the side effects. It's really a middle ground. Mm-hmm. Yes, it's great. We're able to see a small subset of lung cancer patients who may be cured of their metastatic cancer. We can't say that yet, but and again, in general, the side effects are low, but it's not without side effects. And so we do have patients who come in with very bad autoimmune diseases who, and I know I can't treat them with this type of therapy, whose hopes are dashed because I just can't do it because of the overwhelming possibility of terrible side effects. So again, it's that getting everybody in the middle ground, I guess.
Hi, Liz Szabo from Kaiser Health News. I'd like you to address the issue of hype, since that's part of the title. Vinay Prasad at OHSU has pointed out that less than 10% or 10% at most of the 1.7 million Americans with cancer have an approved immunotherapy option. As you mentioned, there's nothing approved for breast or prostate or pancreas yet, or ovarian. And I have talked to a lot of people who have said that they put great hope in immunotherapy. I've talked to a woman with metastatic breast cancer who said, I get so tired of having to tell people why immunotherapy won't help me. And I was hoping you can talk about that. And Otis Brawley at the American Cancer Society said there are places right now that are actually marketing immunotherapy for lymphoma, and he said there are people who are giving up a chance for curative treatment with chemo because they're holding out hope for something that's unapproved in immunotherapy. And I'm just wondering if you think, do we need to ratchet down the hype, or maybe help people have more realistic expectations?
I would say yes. I think it's, when you have, we have it within our clinic where these drugs are approved, so for some groups of patients, having complete, so just an example, a patient of mine with, again, a driver mutation where a pill was working great, and the next type of therapy that actually would work better than immune therapy is chemotherapy, and there is no way this person is going to want to take chemotherapy. And so trying to discuss just within, in that patient situation, again, it's an approved therapy that actually may control their disease well for a long period of time. That's a discussion, let alone someone who, again, like you said, is passing up the chance for known curative therapy and going on to experimental immunotherapy. I think when you're at the point where, again, being part of those clinical trials would make sense if you have that other therapy as a backup. But I think, like Jonathan, you've seen it. There are some immune therapies that are known to work for lymphoma already, but it's not what we call immune therapy, or right now, checkpoint inhibitors.
Yeah, I think obviously the word hype always has a negative connotation, but what I would say, the word revolutionary is appropriate because it really represents this new approach, right? And so, but having said that, this is the beginning of the revolution, and so as a result, there's only a limited number of cancers right now that have approved immunotherapy as treatments. And so obviously, reporting the details and the facts of how this works is very important in terms of calming expectations in terms of who's going to benefit right now. And I think that I think that's that certainly all of us would agree that in that regard, since what we do is very regimented in terms of setting up clinical trials, figuring out what works, we want to know for a fact where things are going to work and where they're not going to work. And so it's a very methodical process. And even though when you read all the hype, you may think it's not. And again, I think that the approach is revolutionary, but we're just at the beginning of trying to understand exactly how we're going to make it work for more and more cancers. I mean, it's just really exciting that we've gotten it to work for the number of cancers that we have already, but there's a lot of work. I guess the theme is there's a lot of work left to do.
Maybe spinning with that, we've heard a little bit about the challenges of the hype. Are there any specific recent developments that are genuinely hopeful that you think will be able to open up these immunotherapies to more types of cancers? And I know it's very early days, and hopefully without getting too terribly technical.
Well, I mean, I think that, obviously we take care of a lot of patients who it's not going to work for them. And so from our perspective, we don't want it hyped up too much because we have to deal with those expectations. And so that's why we do the work that we do in terms of clinical research and trying to find the right combinations that will help more people. But I think that one of the things in terms of, again, in the area of some of the other diseases that where there is no approved agent, I do think there is, I don't want to inflate our own work, but the idea of selecting these patients that respond, I mean, the hope with immunotherapy is that patients could get some amount of treatment. We don't know how much that treatment is. We don't know if it's 6 months, 1 year, 2 year. I mean, that is a whole field in itself, trying to figure out how long someone has to be treated. And then for them to have durable responses because their immune systems have memory. And we're seeing that. So in these patients are responding, in terms of, a lot of what our chemotherapies for pancreas cancer and colon cancer, we say, they'll respond for 5 to 6 months or 8 to 9 months. And we're now, for some people, counting in terms of years for the response. So I think that is why we have hype and we have hope, but it is true that it doesn't apply to the majority of our patients at this time. So that's why we're working towards that. I don't know if I actually answered the question.
Yeah. I think specific combinations that may broaden is right now, again, in my mind, a little counterintuitive, but combining the therapy with chemotherapy. Again, our thoughts was like chemotherapy, that's actually going to not help. It could actually dampen your immune response, but actually may allow certain tumors to expose the abnormal proteins where otherwise it's difficult, or may actually regulate the immune system in a different way or positive way so that the checkpoint inhibitor can actually work. So for lung cancer, that's probably the closest combination, but some of these other dual checkpoint inhibitors or checkpoint plus a co-stimulatory molecule may actually help some patients who already are close to responding but just need something else to actually put them over the edge so that their own immune system can respond. But Jonathan, you're in the lab.
Yeah, I think, you know, as immunologists, we know that there are so many checkpoints, and in a sense, it's remarkable that just using an antibody against one of them works so well some of the time. And so we're very excited about, as we start to target other checkpoints and then do combinations, you know, the 1-2 punch or even a novel checkpoint is going to be able to, we're going to start to see these remarkable, we're hoping to see these remarkable kind of effects. And, you know, along those lines, an area that we work in actually has to do with immunometabolism and targeting the metabolism of the tumor, and that as a means of enhancing immunotherapy. Julie mentioned chemotherapy plus immunotherapy. I think this idea of combination therapy, for example, we're very much involved in blocking the adenosine A2A receptor, which is adenosine comes from the tumor and it shuts off the immune system. And so by blocking its ability to shut off the immune system, we think that's exciting. And then another area which I think is really remarkable too is the area of adoptive cellular therapy or T-cell therapy. Some of you might know there's CAR T-cell therapy. And admittedly, particularly in the last, I'd say half a year, they've seen some problems, but I think what we're going to see in the not too distant future is the first approval of these cellular therapies. And to me, that's remarkable because a lot of times the CAR T-cell therapy is in situations where there's just tumor everywhere. And to me, you know, I always know that, you know, when I had a patient like that, and I would be thinking, God, you know, there's no way we're going to get rid of everything. And to see some of the results of this, you know, where you grow up the T cells, engineer them, and then put them back in the patient, I think that's really exciting. And this is just the beginning because some of the things I've seen in terms of the cleverness of making adoptive cellular therapy even better are really remarkable. So I think in the area of checkpoint blockade, there are more checkpoints that we're really excited about. In the area of adoptive cellular therapy, CAR T cells, we haven't even seen the approvals there yet, and that's going to be very exciting. And then we hope, again, learning from our successes, that finally we're going to really get it right in terms of this idea of cancer vaccines, because now we sort of know what the immune system is looking at. And so now that we know, we can make vaccines against those things. So those are the areas that I think are really exciting.
Over here.
Yeah, so I found the idea of potentially getting pembrolizumab approved for patients with MSIE high characteristics across cancer types was pretty interesting. And I was wondering, first of all, if that happened, what would be the significance of that? And are there other characteristics that cut across cancer types that people are working on getting immunotherapies approved for that would not be specific to one cancer, or is this like sort of a special case?
Yeah, so we would be totally excited if we could get approval for that indication, because that would be something very new where you're approving something based on a molecular phenotype instead of actually a histology, so the tumor type. It's actually at the FDA for review. So it is a possibility, but we don't know the answer to that question, but we hope that that will become true for our patients. There are definitely features across multiple tumor types. The thing about MSI or mismatch repair deficiency that is a little simpler is that actually these tests have been around for decades. And the reason is because there are diseases such as endometrial cancer and colon cancer where we're trying to identify patients with Lynch syndrome. And there's another reason as well. In colon cancer, in stage 2 or early stage colon cancer, if you have a mismatch repair deficient tumor, we actually don't give those patients chemotherapy because they don't benefit from chemotherapy if they have a mismatch repair deficient tumor. So these tests have been around for a long time to identify these patients. So the other things that people are looking at, the tests haven't been around for as long. Things like mutational load, how many mutations a tumor might have. Things like immune infiltrates. Well, how well can we quantify immune infiltrates? Some people are looking at expression, an inflammatory milieu in the tumor that says, yes, there are cells waiting there to be activated, looking at T cells actually in the tumor. They're looking at PD-L1 expression. So there are lots of things across tumor types. But in terms of something where there is an assay that is out there, that's been out there for a couple of decades, that's what makes it a little bit different than the other ones that might go across other tumors, where there's some other kind of pan-tumor things that I'm missing.
I think for immunotherapy, yes, the MSI really does hit home. I think, in the future for other patients with driver mutations, in our minds, in general, it would be great to say if you have this particular mutation, it doesn't matter what cancer you have. That still hasn't been completely disproven or proven. So we're certainly looking at that. And that's really goes to the NCI match trial to try to see, if for a group of patients, will a particular mutation treated by an X drug, will that really work across that group as a whole? And can we then get drugs approved for use based on that?
Hi, I'm Barbara Moran. I work at Boston University, and I have kind of a big picture question. So I cover all kinds of science, not just medicine or immunotherapy. And it's interesting because I feel like immunotherapy, the idea of it's been around for like 20 years, and then it never happens. And I was like, it's never going to happen. But then something happened, like in the last 3 years, and then or 5 years, and suddenly there's therapies. And I was wondering can you give me a little bit of context about, was there some thing that happened, or some new technology, or some new understanding that happened that suddenly tipped it into now at the beginning of, happening in patients and becoming translational?
Yeah, I think, so 2 things. And so one, maybe the most important, is that is checkpoint blockade. The idea is that these antibodies that blocked these proteins that normally the protein would give a negative signal to the immune system. And by giving patients these antibodies, preventing the negative signal, we were seeing these remarkable responses in people. That, unequivocally, that, was extraordinary and worthy. For example, in immunology, we can even date it, because in 2013, Science Magazine designed that immunotherapy was the breakthrough of the year. And so I like to say that breakthrough was based on checkpoint blockade. And the second thing, which again hasn't yet been approved, but I think is going to be equally as striking, is this idea of CAR T-cell therapy. We always knew that T cells could fight cancer, but in a sense, we were always using wimpy T cells. And so with breakthroughs in genetic engineering, people could finally truly engineer a patient's own T cells so that it wouldn't get shut off by the cancer, which is very clever. And the results were extraordinary. Again, taking patients who had cancer all over their body, and when you put in this army of T cells, engineered T cells, they were able to wipe out the cancer. So I think those 2 events really, to me at least, and the naming of immunotherapy as a breakthrough of the year in 2013, that really is the kind of start point of what the change.
I'd actually like to follow up a little bit, because as a fairly recently trained immunologist, I never learned about checkpoint inhibitors. And it kind of seemed like it just was a dark horse that came out of nowhere. For years, so many different immunotherapies were tried, thinking typically about cancer vaccines and the more traditional immunotherapy approaches. So I guess, can anyone say why this works so well when so many other things have failed, or it just works and we're glad it works and we're moving forward trying to understand why, to do combinations, to help more patients? Because, I mean, what sets PD-1 and CTLA-4 apart from everything else that we've tried?
So one thing that actually even as a student always bothered me, so I became an immunologist because I thought the specificity of the immune system, the ability of an immune cell to recognize a cancer cell and kill it, but leave the normal cells alone. That's what attracted me, and I should say probably a lot of immunologists who are interested in cancer. But what always struck me as being illogical was a lot of the hype around immunotherapy prior to the recent success with checkpoint blockade was just trying to soup up the immune system. But we ignored the fact that the tumor avoided the immune system to begin with, right? And so I think the game changer, if you will, is that finally we directed our therapy against why the immune system wasn't working in the first place. And that reason is that the tumor, no matter how good no matter how good a vaccine was, the tumor was sending these negative signals and thereby negating any good we did. And so these therapies targeted those negative signals, and lo and behold, like I said, even in people, which is, of course, what we strive for, by inhibiting those signals, now we weren't just making the immune system more robust, but we were inhibiting the ability of the tumors to escape. And to me, I think that is one of the clear differences. And again, the beauty of it is we can learn from that success, right? So we had a lot of failures in the beginning, and now we can go back to vaccines which really haven't worked the way we wanted to and say, wait a second, maybe if we make the vaccine, but this time we use checkpoint blockade with it, we can really achieve our goal. To me, that's what was the change. So.
Are the things that block the immune system, are there antibodies to the checkpoint inhibitors?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So so right now the approved right now the way we're blocking these inhibitory pathways that checkpoint blockade is by using antibodies, right? However, as I mentioned, people are thinking of some really clever ideas which involve small molecules. For example, this adenosine receptor, the A2A receptor, is actually a small molecule. And what's really neat about that is it's a pill. You take a pill, and it's like a drug, and that drug is blocking an inhibitory pathway. And so whereas now most of what we have are actually antibody therapy, I think in the future we're going to see some really clever other means of blocking these negative pathways as well.
Repeat customer.
Kind of a follow-up to that. This morning we heard some really exciting talk about antigen-presenting nanoparticles as potential immunotherapies, and you're talking about a small molecule as immunotherapy. Y'all might not be precisely the people to speak about this, but you would be more familiar in terms of the regulation and getting a new therapy approved with some of these technologies. Would that be more challenging than, say, an antibody, a small molecule, or this new realm of cell-based therapies?
Well, so these guys, I can speak generically, they deal with it. But I can say is that we've been very impressed with the FDA in terms of really keeping up with the times. As you can imagine, cell-based therapies, right? I mean, that really, the idea of taking out cells, doing stuff to them, even genetically modifying them, and then putting them back in patients, there's a lot to regulate there. And so, so something like that it's heroic to, meet all the hurdles from a regulatory point of view. But on the other hand, I think the FDA has been very, up to speed in terms of devising paths to do that. The other thing that, as I think these guys would agree as immunologists, is that we're convinced that the true cures are going to lie mostly in combination therapy. right? And so it's been a little, would you say a little bit easier now to get combinations together than it was maybe 5 or 6 years ago?
Right, absolutely. Getting combinations of different therapies is much easier to get through as an idea as long as it's scientifically based. But I think, you know, when you're talking about payloads on nanoparticles and things like that, it certainly does give the FDA a huge challenge, but I think they're up to the challenge at this point. I think they're willing to hear and listen about technology as it's coming forward and using that to, again, better our patients' lives, you know, all within reason. But I think a lot of drugs have, the clinical trial design and the design of drugs from 20 years ago till now has drastically changed to the point where I have trainees who are like, well, you know, I want a drug that's going to go straight into humans. You know, before it was like 1 in 10 drugs or devices would get into humans and actually work. But now I think that's actually changing because, again, a lot of drugs or devices are being designed to do what they need to do, not just, you know, put together a few molecules just because it looked good just in the mice. So.
I guess, you know, we're aware that research is hard, getting funding for research is hard. What are some of the other stumbling blocks that you've come across that were maybe a little bit more surprising?
I think some stumbling blocks, again, when I first started with these type of therapies, was actually getting companies to work together. I thought, you know, that originally was very hard. Now it's changed a lot more because, you know, people are realizing that they can't have these huge portfolios, that they do have to rely on early development in some of these biotech companies. So they want to partner with these other companies, and I think it's easier to have companies work together than before, but it still can be a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, some stumbling blocks in terms of some of the things that you're talking about, things that are a little bit harder to regulate, like cell-based therapies. I've worked with cell-based vaccines and listeria-based vaccines, so all those things are a bit more of a challenge to work with. But again, I think it's easier than it used to be. But it continues to be a challenge, and all these agents are probably going to have to work in combination. But I think since the time I started, it's getting easier and easier to actually combine 1 or 2. Now we actually have studies where we're combining 3 or 4 different things. But then in the end, if we do have a great outcome, which is what we would hope for, then we might have to do some stepping back and looking at what was really contributing as well. So that makes it more complicated as well.
Quick and easy question. Can you give us a list of the types of cancers for which there are now approved immunotherapy treatments?
I have lung cancer, squamous cell carcinoma of the head and neck, bladder cancer.
Go slowly.
So non-small cell lung cancer, squamous cell cancer of the head and neck, bladder cancer. I just made this list the other day.
Merkel cell carcinoma.
Merkel cell carcinoma, melanoma, of course, kidney, renal cell carcinoma, kidney cancer.
Lymphoma.
Yeah,
Hodgkin's
yeah, Hodgkin's lymphoma.
Hodgkin's lymphoma.
Yeah. Oh yes, we said melanoma.
You said melanoma.
Yeah.
You said kidney. Right?
Yeah, kidney. Yeah. And others are very close.
I guess from a practical perspective, are patients having issues dealing with high costs of immunotherapy compared to more traditional treatments? Or is that getting absorbed by someone other than the patients?
For the most part right now, we haven't had an issue for our patients getting standard of care immunotherapy. But, you know, again, it depends on what the patient has to pay. You know, if the patient has to pay a 20% copay, that's a huge, huge issue. But in general, the companies that are marketing these drugs also do help with patient care costs as well. So right now we haven't had a huge issue, but I think going forward that may be. I know patients are very worried about their coverage, about these type of drugs. They certainly are asking about, can we get it less often instead of every 2 weeks or every 3 weeks? Could we receive it every 6 weeks and still get the same outcome? Or when can we stop? No one wants to stop the therapy, but if it's costing me, you know, $2,000 every time I come in, let alone some of the other costs that go with it. That can't be, for most of us, we can't afford that long term. So, people are asking these questions, and that's, again, right now we're relying a lot on the philanthropy of various companies. And again, so far we've been okay, but I think, depending on the environment, the healthcare environment, that may change. So I think I'm the only person that's been treating this as standard of care, so. Yeah.
I think we have a few more minutes if anyone has lingering questions.
We've answered it all, so.
Covered it extensively.
Yeah. Oh,
yeah.
Why did you say melanoma, of course?
well, melanoma has, immunotherapy for melanoma has been around for a very long time. There's drugs like IL-2 or interferon that have been used for melanoma for a very long time. And again, originally, the companies that we worked with really didn't even want to study any other tumors except for melanoma, which was known that some type of immune therapy would work for that, as well as kidney cancer. And so when our colleagues, thought of immunotherapy, they only thought of those two tumors, not any of these other tumors at all. So, and most of these drugs get put into melanoma for the first. Most of these drugs that are coming out for the first time are being evaluated in melanoma first, because the bar is a little bit lower for those drugs compared to some of these other harder combinations or tumors that are it's hard to crack, like prostate cancer. Or hormone-positive breast cancer, where we just haven't gotten into those areas yet with immunotherapy. But I think in the end, I think we will, as we learn more with technology, things are changing a lot quicker than they used to, and I think we're going to find out more ways to try to figure out how to use your own immune system, even in those cancers where right now it's much harder.
If it's if you keep knocking over these cancers one after another that you didn't anticipate with a drug that's already been developed, how come the drugs are so expensive? And can you really call it philanthropy if it's part of the price that goes into causing it to be so expensive to begin with?
Oh, definitely. It definitely is an issue for our patients. And but back in the day, companies wouldn't even go there, and the only way you could get a particular drug is for compassionate use, which we could never even get close to being able to do. And now, again, people are much more open to being able to do this. So again, yes, that you can't really call it philanthropy, but again, at least there's something out there for patients to actually not completely rely on, but maybe give them a glimmer of hope to be able to get the drugs or afford the drugs if they don't have coverage.
I mean, on another note, I've never worked for one of these companies. For every drug that's at market, there are dozens or hundreds that they worked on for years that never made it. And so there's a huge pipeline that goes through, and they are companies. So
that's always been true, right? I mean, is there something about these drugs now and the technology that's required to make them that
it is
them
relatively expensive to make monoclonal antibodies.
Yeah. And I say the same goes for our targeted therapies as well. Targeted therapies, the pills that are being developed to use in a small subset of patients as well. So, but again, hopefully that will change, and potentially competition may help as well. I mean, you name it, every company is developing one of these drugs, or at least multiple combinations. So we're hoping that it will help drive down the price as well.
Other than the blood-brain barrier, what are the other impediments to getting some of these compounds to work for GBM and other neurocancers?
Yeah, I think that, so that's a great question. And all I can tell you is that we've been thinking a lot about this, and I think there's some great research in terms of making these therapies so that they can work in different brain tumors. And so my prediction is that we're going to be able to figure that out. One of the issues is when you cause the battle in the brain, you can also have some side effects that, you know, when it occurs outside the brain can be tolerated. But having said that, there are some clever ways to get immunotherapy to work for the different brain tumors as well, and hopefully we'll see the fruit of that research, you know, in not too distant future.